Good afternoon. Welcome at the Open University for the public defense of Mr. van Karspel's PhD thesis. And a very warm welcome to our guests. We have guests from on the internet. This is Professor Kriekel. You will see her shortly. She's from the Technical University of Berlin. Also a special welcome to Professor Baumgartner, who flew all the way from Bergen this morning in Norway. Very warm welcome also to Dr. Heerlen from Groningen, Dr. Kalis from the Utrecht University, Professor Bransen from the Radboud University, Professor Evink is from the Open University, Professor Slors, the co-supervisor, and Professor Muller next to me from the Erasmus University. We will shortly start questioning the candidate in about 15 minutes, but first we give him the floor to present the main findings of his thesis. The floor is yours.
Friends, colleagues, and family, thank you for honoring this ceremony with your presence. I've been given the chance to summarize in about 10 minutes my PhD thesis, and I'll walk you through the problem I'm claiming to have solved, the solution I'm defending, and the broader relevance of my research. The problem is that of mental causation. How can something mental cause something physical? For example, how can a desire for a beer, something mental, cause something physical, behavior in walking to the fridge? Now, this sort of explanation is of the sort used in psychology. Desires and other mental states are used to causally explain behavior. There is a competing explanation, though, from neuroscience. Brain processes also causally explain our behavior. Now, who is right? Both, you may think, but in philosophy there is a nagging issue, the problem of mental causation, or the causal exclusion problem, that appears to force the conclusion that the mental phenomena actually do not do anything, and that instead it is our brains doing all the work. The mental phenomena are then left as epiphenomena. They're causally inert, and we may as well get rid of them. This would undermine the science of psychology, because it would have nothing left to study, so we would have to get rid of that too. To work towards a solution, we must start by analyzing the problem. Here is the basic causal system under consideration. We see a mental cause and a physical cause of the same effect. Nearly all attempts at solving this issue have focused on defining the relation between the mental and the physical causes. However, as long as we want to say that we cannot simply translate psychological concepts into neurological concepts, so that we can't simply equate them, I do not think that solutions like these can work. Instead, what I do in my dissertation is follow a recent line of research that looks at the problem from the perspective of the theory of causality that underlies these models. That is, I focus on the meaning of the causal arrows and the requirements for the model in which they appear, rather than on the relation between two of the elements in the model. Those who have defended taking this perspective use a theory of causality called interventionism. You can think of this as a definition of what it means to say that one thing causes another. Here are the basics. Consider this model, consisting of two sliders and a speaker. Now, what would it mean for us to say that the top slider causes the volume of the speaker to change? According to interventionists, it means that there is a possible intervention that changes the position of the top slider, such that the volume of the speaker changes, while, and this is important, the position of the other slider is kept fixed. And why is this? Because if it were not kept fixed during our experiment, it may be that the change in volume from the speaker is due to changes in the position of the bottom slider. So to make sure the effect is due to the top slider, the bottom slider must be kept fixed. Now, using interventionism, we can diagnose the mental causation problem. Here is the causal model we've used so far. And if we are to say that the value of our mental state has an effect upon our behavior, then, as we've just seen, there must be a possible intervention upon that mental state such that the behavior changes while the position of our brain is kept fixed. Unfortunately, however, the relation between our mental states and our brains is not like the relation between the two sliders in the previous example. Our mental states and our brain states are not independent. We are no longer Cartesian dualists, and we believe that mental states are somehow determined by or rooted in the brain, or our bodies more generally. And therefore, it is impossible to keep the position of our brain fixed while changing your mental state. I cannot change your mind without altering your brain in some way. So then there is no way to exclude that it isn't the brain doing the causal work rather than the mental state, and we end up with the causal exclusion problem. Here is the response that I advocate for in my dissertation. I argue that taking this causal model as a starting point is simply wrong. The sort of relation that holds between mental states and brain states should not be allowed between variables within one causal model. Instead, what we should do is analyze these relations with respect to separated causal models. Now we can intervene upon a mental state to produce a behavioral change without having to worry about confounding factors like brains within the same model. This does not prevent us from looking at the matter through a different lens. We can also still tell the neurological story. And crucially, visualizing the elements like this allows us to still include the special relation between variables visible through the different lenses with which we can describe the situation. Now, why is this relevant? While this issue is nearly exclusively debated within philosophy of mind, it is thought to be all the more important because it generalizes. It doesn't just hold for mental versus neural causes, because the sort of relation between mental states and brain states also holds, in turn, between brain states and physical states. Brains are made of atoms, after all. So whenever a brain supposedly causes some effect, up pops a confounding factor, namely the atoms upon which the brain states are dependent. And the same goes for all the other phenomena described by the non-fundamental sciences, like earthquakes. We can never intervene upon the occurrence of an earthquake, if we could even do such a thing, which is a concept from geology, without intervening upon the physical state of the particles that are moving during an earthquake. The same issue arises for all special science properties, and that's pretty bad. The threat is that all sciences should be discarded in favor of fundamental physics. What the version of interventionism I defend enables is interdisciplinary causal models, in which we can wholeheartedly say that there are causal relations between phenomena from the special sciences and some effect, and recognize the dependence relations between our descriptions of a certain cause when looking at it through different lenses. So going back to the first question of who is right, the psychologist or the neuroscientist, or even the physicist. They all are. It just depends on how you look at it. You may be thinking, well, duh, but it took us a long while to get the exact technical specifications for our theory of causality right. The way we are talking about neural and psychological causes in philosophy of mind is simply not an everyday context for causal discussions. And because of that, I think it can be forgiven that we initially forgot about some of the constraints that are usually implicitly obeyed in causal talk. And this is especially true given the fact that before interventionism, we had no means of making these constraints explicit. The specific version of interventionism I defend can be said to enable causal compatibilism. Causal explanations from the perspectives of various sciences are compatible and not in competition. And using interventionism, I show exactly why the problem of mental causation is a fallacy, something that couldn't be done with earlier theories of causality. And moreover, this specific version of interventionism allows us to create interdisciplinary causal models featuring phenomena from different sciences without issues of causal exclusion arising. And finally, and most generally, this theory legitimizes the various lenses we use to view the world. It legitimizes the different sciences and the continued use of their concepts in causal explanations. Now, after this very brief summary of my dissertation, I will now return the floor to the rector.
Thank you very much, esteemed candidate. I would like to give the floor to Professor Kriekel from the Technical University in Berlin. Is that possible?
I will do it.
You will do it. Very good.
I'm assuming. We may need some technical support. She's here, but I cannot see her yet.
Hello, can you hear and see me?
I can hear you, but not yet see you. 1 second. I may have to stop the screen sharing. Let's try and do that. There we go.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for the talk, and also thank you for your dissertation, which I enjoyed reading. Now, after your talk, so I have 2 quick questions. The first is, or both questions are related to how you make use of Davidsonian metaphysics and combine it with interventionism. So after your talk, maybe first can you say a little bit more on which role Davidsonian metaphysics plays here? And the other question is more specifically on the notion of, so you say that causal relations are extensional coming from Davidsonian metaphysics, and you argue that Woodward's interventionism is compatible with that view. So you say on page 158 that Woodward agrees that causal relations are relations between features of the world. And then you conclude, as such, his theory of causation is extensional in the way Davidson's is. And now I wonder what exactly is meant by extensional here. So according to what you say here, you seem to think that a causal relation is extensional if it holds between features of the world. But there are 2 other interpretations. I think they're more in line with Davidson's view, namely that a causal relation is extensional if and only if it holds between features of the world independently of how they are described, or a causal relation is extensional if it holds between properties rather than things. And now the thing is that I think I agree that Woodward's theory is extensional in the first sense, so it is about things in the world in the end. But it does not, or I'm not sure whether it's really extensional in the sense of 2 and 3. And now the question now is, do you think that interventionism can accept that causal relation is extensional also in this more demanding sense? Or whether you think that one is sufficient for your argument to work and that you need to specify what exactly is the argument, what do you argue for by combining Davidsonian metaphysics and Woodward? And if my suspicion is true that they are not extensional in the same sense, what does it do to the compatibility of interventionism and Davidsonian metaphysics?
Highly learned opponent, thank you very much for your question. As to your first question, the combination of Davidson's metaphysics and Woodward's interventionism. So what is the role of, what role does Davidson's metaphysics play in sort of the second part of my thesis? My drive has been to say something about both the relata and the relations in the causal models that play a role in the mental causation or causal exclusion debate. And so Davidson's part was mostly to say something about the sort of relata that you can put into causal models. So if I spoke about a combination, or I may have even used the word unification of their theories, I certainly did not mean that somehow they connected. I more meant that they were compatible in the sense that what Davidson says about the nature of variables in a model, or the nature of particulars, is compatible with the way Woodward with the sort of variables that Woodward would allow in his causal models. So it's kind of like, I want to be complete. I want to say something both about the variables and about the relations. And I do think that they, especially in the case of mental causation, the sort of particular, or the sort of relata that you put in the relation kind of also matters for the way you view mental causation. And I think Davidson there, then going to the next part of your question, the extensionality, I think Davidson differs from Kim, for example, in a very important way there, where he says, and I do believe that the first way you characterize his extensionalism is correct, that he believes that events cause other events independently of how we describe them. I guess that's the way I use is extensionalism in my thesis. And I think that is compatible with what Woodward is saying, where he says that the causal relations are between whatever the variables in our models refer to, rather than between some sort of abstract variables or abstracta, I think he calls them. Does this answer your question to a satisfactory degree? Or?
I mean, I think the issue is, that in interventionism, causal relations are defined relative to properties of things. So at least when defining variables, the descriptions do differ. And somehow I was wondering whether interventionism really gives you the resources to infer to the things in the world independently of how they are described. So could you give an argument of why you think that in interventionism descriptions don't matter?
But I do think they matter. So you may have read in various parts in my thesis that Davidson says stuff like they cause each other independently of how they are described. But so I think there's an issue that I need to clarify between sort of intra-level and inter-level descriptions, or inter-level, let's say, properties. That the way Davidson uses properties more like descriptions. And he says there is no fact of the matter when it comes to saying that an event is mental or physical. It is only mental or physical as described. Right? And it doesn't make sense to say that an event causes something qua mental or qua physical. So, and then he's this is sort of an inter-level issue there, where he says there's no fact of the matter which of these sorts of descriptions is right. But within a certain, let's say, level of description, Davidson certainly makes use of the notion of property and says that, well, if we're talking physical, or let's say mental, that's easier for me. If we're talking mental, we can certainly, within a certain vocabulary, distinguish between desires for beer and desires for, I don't know, this defense to be over, which certainly is not present to me right now. But so I think that's where the notion of property definitely plays a role in Davidson. I think that overlaps with the way properties are used, or overlaps. I'm not sure. I think that's very much compatible with the way variables are used in Woodward.
Okay, thank you. Is it okay if I continue the discussion because of time constraints? Professor Baumgartner.
Wait, one sec, I have to take this down. I'm very sorry, but...
No, but she can continue to listen if she prefers to.
I'm okay. I had different instructions, but it's fine by me. No, it's fine.
I want to press you some more on this last point, because I think Beat is right on track here. So you end your discussion of Davidsonian metaphysics by accepting his particularist account of sort of ontology, so his anti-realism with respect to properties. There are just events and things. And you reject his covering law account of causation. And then you say that in an account of mental causation, we still need an account of causation. If it's not Davidson's, we have to have some other account of causation. And then you turn to Woodward to get that sort of gap filled from Woodward. But you turn to an account that gives you causation between variables, very explicitly between, so type level causation. You don't turn to an account that gives you token level causation between particular events or things, even though Woodward has in fact a token level theory of causation on offer, but you don't talk about that at all. You focus entirely on his variable centered type level theory, and so I'm left with the impression that you just don't get from Woodward what you need from him. So you don't get an account of causation that underwrites token level mental event causation.
Highly learned opponent. Thank you very much for your questions, and also thank you for your honest and extremely thorough comments on my dissertation earlier. But I do believe that you're wrong, because I was not clear enough. Davidson's own account of causation certainly refers to types. Like he subscribes to a nomic subsumption model of causation, or the nomological theory of causation. And so what he says is, my tokens, whenever there is a case of causation, This is causation between tokens, causation between particular events or things. But what makes it, or why we speak of those instances as cases of causation, is because, according to Davidson, there is a type-level description, a type-level law, that describes cases like those. So for Davidson, it is about the types. Davidson wants causally efficacious mental types. The criticism he gets is that he cannot have that because he ties it to strict laws, and there's only physical strict laws. So when Davidson says, sure, these tokens, in reality, they cause stuff independently of how we describe them, but when they are causally efficacious, there must be a physical, or there must be a strict, which for him means physical law, a type-level law that describes those cases.
But you need an account of how token-level processes connect to these type-level laws, as you call it. You're not going to say that every instance of a type that is sort of on the type level causally relevant for some effect, whenever it's instantiated, it's also a cause of whatever happens downstream. Only particular instances of types are also going to be token-level causes. And you need a particular a theory of how the type level is connected to the token level if you want to talk about causation on the token level.
So I think Woodward does give me this. Woodward says, so the Woodwardian version of causality theory that I discuss is the type level causation. And Woodward says, for what I'm connecting, and I've not been clear about this in my examples.
Yeah, but think about all these cases of like preemption or overdetermination. You have a law, say a very primitive law. Whenever I throw a rock into a window, it shatters.
Yes.
Now we can perfectly conceive of a scenario where I throw a rock and my neighbor throws a rock, and his rock is just slightly faster than mine. So his rock shatters the window, even though I, just by throwing this rock, instantiated the type rock throwing, but it's not that my rock causes so I need a theory of how the type level structures that you get from Woodward connect to the token level, and that you don't get from his type level theory.
So how I'm interpreting your question is that you want to know how can I be sure that whenever a certain type is instantiated, a certain effect pops up?
What I want is an account of token level causation, an account where we have event A causes event B, if and only if, and then comes some analysis. That's not, I don't see this anywhere here.
And I don't think Woodward gives us this.
Yeah, Woodward, he does. There's a theory called AC, actual causation. He has, it's like on page 70-ish around in the book. I don't have the exact part. There is a theory of token level causation where he exactly specifies how other variables that are relevant on the type level need to be fixed in order to find out about causation on the token level.
But then I would say...
this theory has been heavily criticized, I mean, for various reasons, and so I would say the state-of-the-art interventionist theory of token-level causation is not to be found in Woodward, but in the work of Joe Halpern or Chris Hitchcock at the moment. But you don't talk about that at all.
Because I would say I don't care about token causation at all. So I'm going to be very blunt.
You want to back up Davidsonian metaphysics, Davidsonian token-level causation with a theory of causation?
I don't. I want to back up Davidsonian type-level causation. I want to save the types. It's all about saving the types that are used in psychology or other special sciences for continued use in causal explanation.
I'm sorry, but I didn't see that at all from the first part. You specifically reject properties, types, all of these sort of type-level entities, and you say all that is there are tokens, things and events. That's it.
Okay. I certainly discard or disagree with certain implementations of what types mean. So I disavow the ontologically heavy notion of types or properties that Jae-Kwon Kim holds. But I do want to say that even though Davidson has a different view of what properties are, descriptions rather than sort of ontologically real things or constituting parts of particulars, even though Davidson has a different view of what properties or types are, I still want to save the causal relevance of the types and not the tokens. And I'm very sorry if that wasn't clear enough in the first part of my thesis.
So you're saying that the first part of your thesis, the metaphysics on Davidson, ends with the conclusion that we need a theory of type-level causation?
I will gladly agree with you to say that that wasn't clear enough.
There's nowhere do you say something like this. We need a theory of token event causation. That's what you say, and that's something very different from saying that we need a theory of type level causation.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I can explain now then, because let's say if it's not here, the point has never been that the tokens are in need of defending their causal efficacy. Tokens have always been, in most of the discussions say, sure, token causation has been taken care of because the tokens are identical, so they cause stuff, that's fine. But how
are you saying token level causation is sort of a given? It's trivial, it's not a problem?
Because Davidson and Kim, they all say, well, okay, so we're token identity theorists. So all our mental properties that are in the world, the descriptions, the events, they're in the world, that's fine.
Yeah, but that's a different question. It's still that even if we're identity theorists, that there's an issue with how to account for causation between events. Under what conditions does event A cause event B?
That is not an issue.
That's far from trivial.
Okay, but that's not an issue I'm touching at all. So my main concern is saving the use or legitimacy of the causal types, or the non-fundamental types. That's all I care for. Yeah, apparently.
Okay, so I read the first part of your thesis completely differently, and I don't see that in there at all.
Thank you. The discussion is continued by Dr. Heerlen from the University of Groningen.
Esteemed candidate, I have a question about your proposed solution to the problem of mental causation, where the idea is that we split these representations, and on the one hand we represent the physical or neural level, on the other hand we represent the psychological variables, but we shouldn't mix them. But I'm not sure if this is really a good solution. I have defined it myself some years ago, but now I think it doesn't work actually. The reason for that is that even though we kind of ignore or leave out those physical representations, we still know that all the kind of difference-making information is available there at the physical level. And in the end, causation in this interventionist framework is about relationships of manipulation and control. And now we know that all the information regarding manipulation and control can be found if we just look at the neural or physical variables. So the psychological variables don't really add any kind of new difference-making or manipulationist information. So how does this solve the causal exclusion problem then?
Highly esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for your question. You say because there is more, or at least all the causally relevant information available at the neural level, what then does the psychological level add? Should we not discard it anyway, even though we've not created any, let's say, problematical causal models with variables that shouldn't be in there together? Still, couldn't you say, well, now we have these separate models, why not discard the psychological model? And I think this is because these psychological concepts cannot be reduced to the physical concepts. If we were able to do this, just say make a translation manual from psychological concepts to physical concepts, then yeah, sure. Then once our neurological theory was complete, we could get rid of the psychological concepts and with that the psychological causal models. But I don't think that's ever possible. I think there is a certain value in looking at the world through a psychological lens, and that the sort of the meaning of these concepts can never be lawfully translated to the meaning of neurological concepts. I also think that kind of like the spatio-temporal, resolution of these psychological concepts is just different from those of the neurological concepts. So I think there's independent value in keeping these psychological concepts and keeping these models there. And I think my solution allows them to be there without, causal issues popping up. And I think it's valuable, and it's uniquely valuable. That is my position.
But still, we know that all the causal knowledge is also there at the neural level. So is it the idea then that it's just the psychological things have more like heuristic values? They can indeed be valuable, but they don't really tell us how the world works.
So I firmly disagree with your statement that all the information is at the neural level. I don't think that's the case at all. I think a psychologist can track patterns in the world that a neurologist simply cannot track. So I think it's a different and unique way of looking at the world in which you can see regularities that you cannot see through a neural lens, so to say.
Thank you. I have another question about supervenience. So both you and Davidson sometimes talk about supervenience as a relationship between descriptions or vocabularies, whereas usually it's seen as a relationship between properties. It's an ontological metaphysical notion, and you cannot change the psychological properties without changing the neural properties. But I don't see how the whole concept makes any sense in the context of vocabularies or descriptions, because we can change the description of a psychological event without changing the physical description. So the whole concept of supervenience seems to be very badly suited for this use.
So I disagree. So of course, you're absolutely right that there's a very big difference between Davidson and Kim when it comes to the sorts of things that they think supervene on each other. And as I think I talk about this a little bit in some of my chapters, where I say that for Kim there is an ontological dependence of the mental properties on the physical properties. And the mental properties cannot change. Like, there's an existential dependence of them upon physical properties that are constituting parts of particulars in the world. And I think for Davidson that's completely different, although Davidson too discusses this issue in a way that in terms of the words he uses, sounds compatible with what Kim is saying. But I think Davidson's position is really different. He says, no, so the supervenience is between, like you said, levels of description. And why would that not be suitable for the supervenience use? I don't agree that it's not suitable. Because of course, so I'm saying that, and Davidson is saying, that two levels of description both depend upon sort of the world we're describing. And what the supervenience between these two levels of description means is that when the world changes, and so there must be a change in, let's say, the low-level description of the world, I'm sorry, the high-level description of the world, then it cannot be that there should not be needed an update to the description of the lower-level lens through which we're looking at the world. I'm sorry, it's very vague, but so the lower level description of the world must change if it is to be correct, if there is a change that requires a change in the higher level description of the world. And I think that's a very useful notion of supervenience, because it, like Davidson says, it implies monism. It implies that we are talking about overlapping parts of the same world. If there was somehow a high level change in the world, let's say I changed my mind, and a neurologist says, well, nope, I don't see any change, then we may be wondering, well, where did this change happen? I think the fact that the neurologist says, well, now I also need to update my description, that kind of tells us that we're both talking about the same parts or areas of the world, and that in that sense, you know, we share a common goal in explaining the world, and we do so with different lenses.
Thank you.
Right. The next question is for Professor Müller from Erasmus University, Rotterdam.
Dear candidate, I'd like to start with a warm-up question. In paragraph 2.1, a counterexample is presented against Davidson's idea to individuate events by space-time regions. The example is a metal sphere which is rotated and heated. I can inform you that a rotating sphere flattens at the poles and that a heated sphere expands uniformly. So they do occupy different regions, and therefore this is not a counterexample to Davidson. Now, I feel slightly uncomfortable that there is soon someone running around the Dutch plains calling himself a doctor when he has forgotten every lesson his physics teacher taught him at secondary school. Please explain yourself.
Highly learned opponent. Thank you for this introductory question. Should I explain myself or Davidson? Because ultimately, the problem seems to be how can two events be individuated if they are at the same place at the same time? So Davidson says, if I want to individuate events and tell them apart, I can do so by what they cause, because what an event causes is unique. And then later he says, no, well, maybe we can, and he doesn't want to do that because he thinks there are certain events that take place at the same time and the same place, so that he cannot use time and space to differentiate them. But then later he agrees with Quine and says, well, no, okay, I guess you're right, Quine. Rotating balls that heat up at the same time. And so there's two events here, the heating up and the rotating. They can just happen at the same place at the same time. And now, I'm wondering what your question is.
Well, physics tells you that this is not possible.
Well then the example is simply badly chosen. I'm guessing their physics was also not up to par.
Is there another counterexample then to individuation by space-time regions?
I think so, yes. I'm currently defending my dissertation, and I'm also standing, keeping myself upright. You could say, well, these two events seem to take place at the same time in the same place.
And those are not different descriptions of the same event?
Yes, I think that's Davidson's conclusion.
So there is one event after all?
Yes, I think so.
So it's not a counterexample.
No.
No.
Ha.
Exactly, that was my point.
Okay,
Let me speed to question 2. There is apparently something that I am missing. You are an admirer of Davidson. The causal exclusion problem presupposes there is a physical and a mental event, but according to Davidson, there's no such thing. There's only one event with 2 different descriptions. So why does the causal exclusion problem arise at all for Davidson? There are no 3 events, only 2.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, that's what Davidson said.
Yeah.
He said, well, there's just one event, and that's causally efficacious. Yeah. So, and yeah, we can describe this event mentally, so we have mental causation. Yeah. And so his critics say, no, Davidson, what you haven't saved is the causal relevance or the causal efficacy of the mental types. Because the way you, Davidson, explain the causal efficacy of these events is by saying, yes, we can describe them mentally, but described as mental, there are no strict laws that can cover them in any sort of causal relations. But fortunately, because these events are also physical events, we can describe them physically, and we have strict physical laws. So then we can say, oh, they enter into a causal relation because they can be subsumed under a physical type-level law. And then Davidson's critics say, well, sure, so events cause other events, but they do so described as physical. The mental description of the event that you're giving doesn't add anything to our causal understanding of the world. And we care about using psychological concepts in our descriptions of the world. We want our psychological concepts to be causally relevant, and you, Davidson, don't give us that.
Yeah, I thought you were saying something like this. I move to my 3rd question. In paragraph 2.4, you ask the question, what makes a causal claim true? So this is a request for truth makers. And then you turn to Woodward, but Woodward does not give us a metaphysical theory of truth makers.
That is correct.
So then this doesn't answer the question you pose yourself.
You're right. I should have formulated this differently. I should have said, what makes it justified for us to say that there is probably a causal relation between some event and some other event, rather than what makes it true? Or I should have said, what does it mean for us to say that one event causes another, in virtue of certain types or not? Yeah.
Okay, so you forgot your physics. You cannot properly formulate sentences. Yeah, do I still have time?
You still have 2 minutes.
I still have 2 minutes, yeah. Now, I want to ask you, do you adhere to a event dualism, so that there are mental events and physical events? Is that for you a metaphysical distinction or not? Or is there only one type of event that we can describe in different ways, as Davidson says?
So I think from the way you asked this question, I would agree with the second interpretation. So I think there's just one event, and there's different descriptions. But I think doing metaphysics is thinking about how we can describe the world, how we categorize it, what sort of systems we use. And that way you could say, well, if we have a psychological description and a neurological description, that is a metaphysical distinction, but not in the sense that they're describing different worlds or different realities.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kades from Utrecht University continues.
Dear candidate, I really enjoyed reading your dissertation, and it made me think about the problem of mental causation in a new way. I think you might have successfully shown that the causal exclusion problem need not be a problem for interventionism, your kind of interventionism. However, I think this also means that you must take a pretty radical stance with regard to the question underlying the causal exclusion problem, namely the question, as you just formulated it, what it means to say that one event causes another. And I think what you have shown is that it is not possible to explain the causal role of a mental event or description and the causal role of its subvenient physical event in one and the same explanation, because these events are not independent. And this indeed does mean that the question of causal overdetermination does not come up in an interventionist account. But I would say that this can only be considered a genuine solution insofar as you also defend an anthropocentric approach to causation, not anthropocentric in the sense that you must presume something like human agency, as you discussed in your thesis, but anthropocentric in the sense that an account of causal explanation must answer all relevant questions regarding causation. Would you agree that in order for your solution to be a genuine solution, you must indeed accept that causation is an anthropocentric concept in this sense?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. And I think, yes. And I think I fully agree with Woodward in this sense. Woodward obviously says that his notion of causation or causality, his theory of causality, is not anthropocentric. He says, I don't need human agency to explain causation. But what he does say, and I fully agree, is that the whole notion of causation is only relevant to us as humans because it helps us manipulate the world. It helps us make the world the way we want it to be. So in that sense, yes, and my only interest in solving this problem is so that we humans don't make the same mistake again and putting different variables that shouldn't be in the same causal model in the same causal model. So in that sense, yes, it is only useful to us. It's not like I've changed reality now, I've just changed the way we're talking about it. Yeah. Is this the way you meant the question?
Yes, yes, it is. But don't you think this kind of approach is something that Davidson would definitely reject?
I don't think so. No, certainly not. No, Davidson talks about different ways of describing the world, and he says we can have various vocabularies. They can be anomalous for whatever reasons there are for that. And causal laws are some type-level descriptions described within a certain vocabulary. So I think Davidson would certainly say that causation, so the whole project of thinking about causation is a human enterprise. I don't think Davidson wants to say anything about how causation is happening in the world, because it isn't for Davidson. I think for Davidson, causation, yeah, I shouldn't be stepping in his shoes, I guess. But I think he too would say, yeah, the reason we're interested in causation in the first place is because we're trying to categorize the world. We're trying to talk about the world in a consistent manner. We are humans, so that's why I'm discussing this whole issue. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Professor Bransen from Radboud University, Nijmegen continues.
Yeah, dear candidates, dear friend. Yeah. It's my pleasure to congratulate you with this thesis. It's a fine piece of work, a lot of good philosophy. And I say this as a philosopher who also think that most of what you say is quite wrong. But that's just a part of what we do as philosophers. We disagree and we need this kind of dialectic to do the things that we do. We love to disagree. I have a lot of questions, but probably my question is just the same as is implied in all the other ones. But I ask it differently. I want to ask it in terms of what kind of realist are you when you talk about causal relations? And I think that both in Peter Strawson and in Davidson, there's an implicit Kantianism. A quite strong Kantianism is implicit there. And for Kant, we can only sensibly talk about reality once we accept that certain forms of sensibility and certain categories are axiomatically given or are transcendentally implied by what we think when we experience the world. So most people think that Kant is a kind of unstable mix between a transcendental idealist and an empirical realist. And I'm wondering what kind of theory of, what kind of realism you hold. And I've got this picture from your thesis. I want to know what kind of relation is the arrow between the I and the X. Is that a causal relation or not? And you can also phrase it in terms of the kind of very nice presentation that you gave where there was this hand, the little hand that's doing some kind of very important work. So Kant would say that this hand is our transcendental assumption of the category of causation, but is itself not a causal, is not itself a causal, is not itself a cause. So is an intervention, is the intervention causing the X to cause that? That intervention itself, can you talk about that in terms of realism? So, or And that's the other option that I would go for. Or is there a kind of pragmatism involved, that we are pragmatists when we talk about causation, and we use descriptions to talk about the way in ways that are sensible, but we don't mean to say that they are real in some kind of metaphysical sense.
Highly learned opponent, thank you very much. I guess I too would be kind of ambivalent between the perspectives you've described. I'm not a Kantian scholar by any means, so forgive me if I hit the plank wrong. First, your technical question, I guess. Can we look at the intervention, sort of the exogenous intervention into the system under consideration? Should we look at that as a cause? Yes, says Woodward, yes, certainly this is a cause. We cause the variable under consideration to change value. And this is a causal relation. And then, of course, he gets criticism and says, well, then you haven't really described causation, because in your definition of what a cause is, you need to use the word cause. And so you've given like a circular definition. And then, of course, Woodward says, well, I think my definition of causality, my ideas of what a causal relation mean, what it means, can be useful without being reductive. So he says, I can say something about one causal relation while having to refer to other causal relations, sure, and that's still a useful thing to do. I don't have to sort of reduce causal talk to some other level talk that doesn't involve any causes whatsoever. So this is not reductive, and yes, we should look at the intervention as a cause. So we need to have causal knowledge we need to know that our intervention causes X, in this case, for us to even think of an experiment. So that's one thing. And the other part, am I a realist or a pragmatist? Well, I think there's two parts in my dissertation. And the first part is more about what do the variables in the models refer to? And when it comes to those, I think I would be a realist. I think there's events and there's things. When it comes to causal relations, I don't think they are there. I don't think those are an extra category in the world. I think causation is one of the ways we talk about the world, like our distinction between things and events also is, by the way.
Okay.
So I would be a pragmatist, I guess.
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Professor Eving from the Open University.
Esteemed candidate, I would like to start with congratulating you with having completed such a beautiful thesis, which I have read with interest and admiration, despite the fact that your area of expertise is very different from mine. Your thesis is written so clearly that even a lost Heideggerian as I am could follow and understand it. At least I like to think so. This immediately brings me to a first observation. As a phenomenologist, for a day carefully entering the field of philosophy of mind, I would start with questioning the dogmatic assumptions of physicalist naturalism that, to put it in very loose formulation, states that only matter that can mathematically be measured is real. You clearly describe this naturalism as a set of assumptions, but you seem to accept it as simply a given that cannot be avoided. Now, I wonder if this really is the case in your approach. And now I am not sure if it would make such sense to have a discussion about the starting point of your thesis, but it does inform the question that I would like to ask you. In order to cope with this naturalism and at the same time save the psychological point of view, or the psychological lens, as you put it, you make a distinction between reality and language. Different scientific approaches are different descriptions of the same reality in terms of Davidson concepts are extensional. The anomalies between physics and psychology, you write on page 156, and I quote, these anomalies occur between descriptions or taxonomies of reality, not parts of reality. So insofar as vocabularies are incommensurable, the worst we are faced with are conceptual problems, not ontological problems. And you end this passage on page 157 by writing, the friction is conceptual, not ontological. Now, because of the time, I will skip my first question. But the second question is about these different taxonomies, mainly between psychology and neurology. The use of divergent taxonomies makes it possible for you to carefully and precisely construct a causation model for psychology that presupposes a subvenient physical level, but also can operate independently from physics. As long as psychology and physics are discussed in different taxonomies, symbolized by different color fields in the Kim-style graphics you made, as long as these are discussed as different taxonomies, you can avoid causal exclusion. The price you have to pay, in my view, is that these different conceptual taxonomies are strictly separated, like different languages. You hope that these different sets of concepts will ultimately be interchangeable points of view, that's what you write on page 154, which will lead to fruitful interaction, that's what you write on page 157, fruitful interaction between psychology and neurology. But what I see is that you can only safeguard psychological research by separating it from neurology, giving it a different conceptual taxonomy. Now, how could this possibly lead to a fruitful interaction or dialogue instead of misunderstandings between different languages, or at best an agreement to disagree?
Highly learned opponent, thank you for your extensive question. I will start with the last part, where you say that I seem to save the causal efficacy of these mental types by separating them from the physical types. And then I say, well, and that can foster interaction. How can it foster interaction if you just separate them? An important part of some of those colorful models that I included is that some of the parts of these models overlap. So what I'm saying is that a psychologist can tell the same story in different words about the cause of an effect that can be described in the same terms in which a physicalist, or let's say a neurologist, is describing the effect. So both a psychologist and a neurologist could agree upon a description of the effect, let's say a certain type of behavior. Say they both want to explain me going to the fridge. So why am I doing this? And the cause, they give different descriptions for the cause. And so because I enable this sort of multi-level thinking about, or multiple descriptions of the same sort of cause, what I then open up as a possibility is that the neuroscientists and the psychologists start thinking about how maybe these two variables that they have now unproblematically included in sort of a diagram, not a causal model, but in a diagram, can relate. So now they can start thinking about the relation between the two and how, in terms of mechanism, for example, the brain can explain certain physical or certain mental descriptions. So, for example, the psychologist says, I want some beer, and the neuroscientist can then say, oh, well, we find these and these brain activation patterns that also causally explain the behavior. And now we can start thinking about how these brain activation patterns maybe somehow, I don't know, mechanistically explain what's going on in terms of the psychological description. So in this sense, it enables multi-level discussions. So what I don't want to do is a discussion or a solution that I've seen elsewhere in the literature, where people say, well, yeah, we should separate these models. So we should have two sorts of models, psychological explanation models, neurological explanation models, and they should not interact. And my innovation, if you want to call that, is kind of like to use color codes and combine these two so that you can see the relation between the variables used in the different sciences. And I think that can only foster like mutual understanding.
But as I understood it, these causal explanations are only possible if you describe the effects in either neurological terms or psychological terms. So the way a psychologist would describe you walking to the fridge is a different description in different terminology than the way a neurologist or a physicalist would describe what happens when you walk to the fridge. So I see overlap in the sense that they are supposed to speak of the same reality, but they do this in different terms of cause and effect. So I still do not see how they speak the same scientific language.
Okay. So I disagree here. I think many scientists approach the same explanandum. They want to explain causally in the same way, whereas they have different descriptions or different methods for approaching the cause. So neuroscientists also want to explain attention, which is a term that also features in psychology, for example. And I'm not saying that me walking to the fridge can also be described in different ways. Sure, let's say a physiologist could explain this in, saying my limbs are moving and stuff like that. Psychologists would say, or I don't know, a folk psychologist would say someone's walking to the fridge. Sure, there are different descriptions of the effect as well, but what my method enables is that you don't have to do that. You don't have to separate your descriptions of the world and say, now I'm describing the world solely in the psychological level. And there's no interaction between that and the physical level. Because that is a prime desideratum of the non-reductive physicalists who want to say that mental stuff can cause physical stuff. That is, we can speak about mental types being causally efficacious in causal explanations for physical types. This is what we want, and I think I'm not the only one who wants that. I think this is the way, well, I don't know, I guess science can progress. That's my answer, yeah.
Thank you.
I do still have another question from Professor Kriekel, but I don't think it's necessary to. Defense, I think you're invited to sit over there. We will withdraw, retire, and come back after a while, after we've discussed the defense. Thank you.